Down by the Sally Gardens by W.B. Yeats. It was published in a collection of poetry called The Wanderings of Oisin and Other Poems in 1889. And in a note on the poem, Yeats said he was trying to reconstruct an old song he'd heard being sung by a woman in the village of Ballisadair in County Sligo. He said he could only remember a few lines of that old song, and he actually named the poem An Old Song Resung, right? An Old Song Resung. So he didn't entitle it to be Down by the Sally Gardens until a later publication in 1895 in a collection called Poems. So the word Sally itself comes from an Irish Gaelic word meaning willow. So these are willow gardens. And of course, the willows were used for the thatched roofs, right, to bind them together. So it was not unusual to find Sally gardens or Sally plantations, or a little area where the willows were growing. Because it was used for roofing, but it also had a secondary nature, and that was it was used as a meeting place for lovers. So it's interesting in Yeats's poem that in the very first verse they meet in the Sally Gardens, so they're meeting as lovers, but in the second verse they meet in a field by the river, so it sets the scene for something else happening there. Now, the old song that Yeats said he heard, and he couldn't remember much of it and couldn't remember the title, is probably You Rambling Boys of Pleasure. And it seems to be that it's the second verse of the You Rambling Boys of Pleasure that has stuck or did stick in Yeats's memory. And actually, I think Jim Perkins sings a version of You Rambling Boys of Pleasure. And it's an oral tradition. So because it's an oral tradition where somebody hears the song and then moves on and they hear somebody else and somebody changes it or whatever, there's different variations, different versions of all sorts of songs. There's tons of songs with different variations, sometimes different words, sometimes different tunes, but the story is somewhat similar. So, and there's one which is quite popular. It says, it was down by Sally's garden. So they're putting an apostrophe S on Sally, so they're calling it Sally's garden. One evening late I took my way. I spied a pretty fair maid, and these words to me she did say. She said to take love easy as the leaves grow on the tree. But I was young and foolish, and with my darling could not agree. See, that's the second verse of You Rambling Boys of Pleasure. And Andy Irvine, when he was singing with Planxty, he had a version of it as well. Again, second verse. Down by yon flowery garden, he calls it a flowery garden, where me and my true love do meet, I took her in my arms, and unto her gave kisses sweet. She bid me take love easy as the leaves fall from the tree. Right? They don't grow on the tree, they fall from the tree. An indication of bad things happening. But I, being young and foolish with my own true love, I did not agree. So You Rambling Boys of Pleasure, the song itself is much longer and a bit more involved and goes into detail about why she leaves him. And of course, it's money or gold that is the reason, for the parting of the ways. Whereas I think the brilliance of Yeats's poem, Yeats's story, is in its succinctness and its simplicity of language. And it's just so clear and so beautiful and so, it's so succinct. It's just said. There's two verses, and that's it. He says what needs to be said, and that's it. And he gives no easy explanation or reason for why they're parting. Right? So it was written as a poem. He did write it as a poem, and it wasn't until 20 years later, that in 1909, that Herbert Hughes set Yeats's poem to an old Irish melody called The Maids of Mourne Shore. And although other people after that put music to it, that seems to be the most popular one. That seems to be the one that's most appealing and that most people associate with Yeats's beautiful, wonderful poem, Down by the Sally Gardens.